declared me a threat to national security, raided my offices, seized my documents, used those documents to steal $230 million of taxes that I paid. I hired a young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky to investigate. He exposed the crime. He testified against the officials involved. Those same officials then arrested him, tortured him, and killed him 358 days later. And I've now devoted my life to getting justice for Sergei Magnitsky. And I've succeeded in getting some small measure of justice. In the United States in 2012, the Senate voted 92-4 to pass the Magnitsky Act. The House of Representatives voted 89%, signed into law on December 14th, 2012 by President Obama. Magnitsky Act now sanctions 49 individuals who were involved in either killing, torturing, or other things connected to Sergei Magnitsky, or more broadly, other terrible abuses in Russia. It imposes visa sanctions, asset freezes, and publicly names the names of those people. It applies globally now. The Canadian government has a Magnitsky Act. The British government has a Magnitsky Act. The Latvian government has a Magnitsky Act. The Lithuanian government has a Magnitsky Act. The Estonian government has a Magnitsky Act. And just a couple weeks ago, without my knowledge, the Gibraltar government passed a Magnitsky Act.
So why is that act important? How is it effective? Does it make a difference?
So the Magnitsky Act is, after Sergei was killed, I first tried to get justice inside of Russia. And in Sergei's case, he wrote 450 complaints during his 358 days of detention, detailing and documenting everything that happened to him. And although those complaints were never acted on by the authorities, we got copies of them. And because we have copies of those complaints, we had the most granular, detailed record of human rights abuse that's come out of Russia in the last 35 years. And because of that, I would have thought, and I tried to get justice in Russia. And the Russian authorities, Putin, had no interest in providing any justice. And Putin personally got involved in exonerating everybody who played a role. The Russian government gave promotions and state honors to some of the people who were most complicit. And in the most shocking travesty of justice, they prosecuted Sergei Magnitsky 3 years after they killed him in the first ever posthumous trial in the history of Russia. So with no possibility of getting justice inside of Russia, I said, how do we get justice outside of Russia? And then I discovered something terrible, which is that there are no mechanisms to get justice outside Russia or outside a country that does these things if the entire government in these countries is corrupt. And so I said, if there's no measures to get justice, then I want to create my own. And I came to Washington, and I told this story of what happened to Sergei to Senator Benjamin Cardin and Senator John McCain. And I said, can we get a piece of legislation passed that freezes the assets and bans the visas of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky? And in October of 2010, they introduced into the political process the Magnitsky Act. And as soon as they introduced it, their phones started lighting up from other victims. And people come calling in from Russia and saying, you found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime.
Which is money.
Which is money.
Right.
Their assets. Can you get the people who killed my brother, my father, and my sister? And so they added 65 more words onto the law, which broadened it out to all bad guys in Russia. And
do that in 65 words?
And they did it in 65 words. And then everybody fanned out across Capitol Hill, all sorts of other victims and opposition figures. And
how tough was it? So what's fascinating to me, and one of the reasons I think you're a hero, is not only because you did this, you had this idea, you then executed on it, right? Everyone's, to accomplish anything, you need a vision and you have to execute. Any business person knows that. Any effective public servant knows that. Describe a little bit of what some of the obstacles were to getting it passed here and in other countries?
So the biggest odds, I've always told the joke that it was not that hard to get passed because there was no pro-Russian torture and murder lobby in Washington.
There's not?
Or there wasn't when I was working on it. But let me just say something that it was not that there was one big obstacle at the time, which was that President Obama had just declared a reset with Russia, and the reset with Russia was effectively let's not complain about anything that they do, and so the U.S. The Obama administration was the main obstacle. That they were saying, listen, Bill, we have all the tools necessary. We think it's terrible what's happened, but we don't think this is the right time and the right thing to do, and so on and so forth. And Senator John Kerry, who's head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he was the one who had the deciding role of what piece of legislation could be considered by his committee, and there was all sorts of stuff. Everything that was behind us jumped ahead of us and just kept on jumping ahead, and it just kept on being stalled. And it was only when there was another piece of legislation that the White House wanted passed, which was the repeal of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which was a historic piece of human rights legislation, which the Obama administration wanted rid of, that we had an opportunity, because they started going to the senators saying, hey, could you vote to repeal this piece of historic, obsolete human rights legislation? And I got to my senator friends and I said, listen, it would be horribly unfair to repeal the most resonant piece of human rights legislation about Russia on the books without and stalling Magnitsky at the same time. And they agreed, and that was what pushed it through.
Do you have information or anecdotal evidence that this kind of thing really does cause the oligarchs to chafe and be upset and be immobilized?
I've got the best, so Putin is not a great poker player, and he shows his cards. And he showed his cards very well in this situation. So when the Magnitsky Act was first put out there, and going into the vote, Putin actually wrote he had a foreign policy white paper, and where he said that stopping the Magnitsky Act was the single largest foreign policy priority. After the Magnitsky Act was passed, Putin reacted hugely emotionally, and he banned the adoption of Russian orphans, and I should point out disabled Russian orphans, the sick ones that Americans were adopting, effectively sentencing his own orphans to death. And then, of course, the most important piece of anecdotal information happened on the 9th of June 2016, when Putin's lawyer or emissary, Natalia Veselnitskaya, went to Trump Tower, and met with Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort with one request, which was to repeal the Magnitsky Act. So we know that Putin cares about it, and then also there was another one when the Canadians passed the Magnitsky Act. Putin was asked at the Valdai Forum, this forum of discussion with Putin among academics and journalists, and he was asked about the Canadian Magnitsky Act, and he went into this 5-minute monologue just personally insulting me and calling me every name and everything about, and you could see that his face was just, this forehead and everything. You just tell that we got under this guy's skin, and so this is the policy that works for Putin and for his corrupt regime.
And what about in other countries? Was the process more difficult or less?
So in a sense, the process was easiest in the United States because of the way that the Constitution is written. That the legislative branch has the same power as the executive branch if they all work together, and so it actually, in spite of the opposition by the administration, the legislative branch wanted to do it 92-4. However, in parliamentary democracies, like in Canada and the UK, Canada took us 7 years to get it done, as opposed to 2 years, because if you can find your members of parliament that want to do it, but if they're in the governing party, no government wants to do this. There's not a government in the world.
You think it's because they have a trade deficit with us? Is that?
So, I think it might be.
Sorry. Can we talk about what's next? So there are a lot more countries in the world. There are a lot more places where people have their money. What are the top priorities for you?
Well, I'm a guerrilla warrior when it comes to Magnitsky legislation. I don't have a big team. There's only about 10 of us, and so we kind of try to see either where we either have the so it's either low effort, high impact, or high effort and amazing impact. And so my single largest target right now is France. Why France? Because there's not a single member of the Putin regime that doesn't have a villa in Saint-Tropez, Cap Ferrat, or Cap d'Antibes. And so that's a heavy lift, France, because there's a lot of people who don't want to do this. But if I can get
that's why, because they like keeping those people happy.
Well,
they like having the money.
I think that there's some it's been confusing for me, but there's sort of there's a lot of people that are just taking the money, and that's not easy. I'm also working on Australia. Australia, I kind of, it's easy. Anglo-Saxon countries are easier for me because I can speak the language, and that helps. I'm going up to Sweden next week. We're having parliamentary hearings, Magnitsky hearings in Parliament in Sweden on Wednesday next week.
Is there another country where you're on the cusp of success?
Well, I think that the closest country for success is Ukraine. Ukraine has a Magnitsky Act going through their parliament. They're obviously not friends with Russia. I'm not sure exactly where it is in the parliamentary process, but I think it's very likely that they can get it. And then I just heard today that Vladimir Karamurza, who many of you know and is a good friend of our efforts and an amazingly heroic figure, was in Denmark. He had one meeting with the Danish Parliament, and apparently there's a piece of Magnitsky legislation currently being drafted in Denmark. And so I mean, and who knows? And if anyone has any ideas,
There's a lot of countries.
There's a lot of countries out there, and so my ultimate goal is to have a standardized global piece of Magnitsky legislation that's implemented by every member of the United Nations, that applies to every human rights violator out there, and that's exercised liberally, so that bad guys can't get away with being bad without no consequences.
Is Putin putting personal pressure to bear on leaders in these other countries where these matters are pending?
He's putting pressure on the leaders. He's putting pressure on the people. To give you an example, I was in Ireland in 2013. And Ireland is another country that's fairly easy for me to communicate with because of language and also the general cultural situation over there. And so I went to Ireland, and they're a real sort of good and evil, black and white type of country, and they like heroes, and they like Sergei Magnitsky, and I had everybody in the Irish Parliament fully committed to this thing. And then the Russian ambassador made an announcement to say that he would ban, or Russia would ban, Irish adoption of Russian orphans, and the whole effort collapsed. And so they'll do everything, and there's not a consistent way that they go about doing this stuff. Sometimes they do it in a subterranean way. Sometimes they do it openly and overtly. They don't really
Is
care.
anyone committing any crimes in connection with?
What's that?
Is anyone committing any crimes in connection with preventing this legislation from being passed?
Are they committing crimes? Oh yeah, they're committing lots of crimes. So one of the most important crimes is that there are a number of people who are potentially on the Magnitsky list, and that actually are on the Magnitsky list, that are spending money in countries that don't have Magnitsky lists to lobby using cash that I would assume is tainted from this crime to stop them being put on the Magnitsky list. And we found that being done in the UK and in Europe by members of people who have already been sanctioned.
Wow. That says 0.
It says 0.
So I don't know if that
We
means...
already ran out of time. That's not fun.
Thank you, Bill.